So hello and welcome. Apologies for the little delay. We had an issue with a microphone. It's a great pleasure to actually start the Europe in the World speaker series with Kreuder-Sonnen here today. So the Europe in the World speaker series is part of the European governance and politics program here at the EUI, as well as the global governance program. And it iterates together with Daniele Caramani's seminar that looks more within the EU, and here with Europe in the World, we look into EU foreign policy making and Europe and how it situates itself in the world. And so Christian Kreuder-Sonnen was so kind to actually follow the invitation to go from this gray University of Vienna environment, apologies, to sunny Florence. Christian is a professor at the University of Vienna, but had also hold fellowships at the University of Oxford and Harvard, so had the chance to talk about Europe and international organizations authority in different kind of academic environments. I can only recommend for you reading his book, Emergency Powers of International Organizations, which won actually the ISA Chadwick Alger Prize. So if you don't know it already, please feel free to actually have a read in it, but it's great to have him here today. Thank you so very much. You're going to present a co-authored paper and the floor is yours.
Thanks a lot. I'll just share my presentation with everyone. That looks quite good. All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for the kind introduction and for the invitation. I'm really happy to be here. Just noticed before, this is the first time for me at the EUI, and it's been great so far, and I look forward to this discussion. I'm speaking about a co-authored paper with Bernhard Zange from the University of Munich, who sends his regards. And I chose a somewhat less unwieldy title for the presentation than what's on the paper, if you had a chance to look at it. So for this this talk, I'll call it Political Contest Theory, Explaining I/O Authority Transfers in the Age of Politicization. And maybe that's a title that we're going to go for with a paper as well eventually. I should say before really starting that this is a paper which has a relatively big theoretical ambition and a relatively narrow empirical ambition. So what we really set out to do is to provide a somewhat new theoretical perspective or framework complementing existing functionalist and post-functionalist theories about international authority and authority transfers to the European Union and international organizations at large, which miss, as we think, some important aspects. And those aspects I want to talk about today. Give an overview, especially on what we would say is the state of the art regarding functionalist, post-functionalist theories. What they can explain, but also where they might have blind spots. And these blind spots we call here undemocratic internationalizations of authority and democratic renationalizations of authority. Maybe not ubiquitous, but still significant phenomena in contemporary international organizations. And then we provide our own political contest theory to explain this, and that's roughly what I'm going to do, and provide some empirical illustration at the end. All right. So what we start from is, I think, a relatively commonsensical assumption that is also shared by prominent, dominant theories in the field, namely post-functionalist and functionalist institutionalists theories. And that is that we live by now in an age of politicization of international organizations. So the rise of authority with the European Union or with other international organizations has also led to their increasing politicization. That is the contestation of international authority, mobilization around issues regarding the political direction of international organizations, and so on and so forth. So there's mobilization, there's polarization, there's more and more actors talking about these IOs, and there's actual political contest around them. So the question, of course, is then what is the what is the consequence of this politicization for international authority and the future of authority transfers to international organizations? And here we have, I think, two very different positions in the literature. On the one hand, we have the post-functionalist approach, associated in particular with Lisbeth Hoche and Gary Marx, who say that the politicization of international authority most strongly leads to an activation of potentially already pre-existing communitarian attitudes in the population. Right? So it's not that out of nowhere we have all of a sudden new communitarian attitudes in the constituencies of democratic states, but that those that were already pre-existing are now being activated, they're being mobilized, and they create a constraining dissensus. So while previously we had this famous what is it called, the permissive consensus, thank you very much. We now we enter an era of the constraining dissensus, where governments' fear of electoral punishment for granting new authority to international institutions actually leads to them not doing that anymore. Right. So the expectation of post-functionalists is actually a standstill in global governance. No more authority transfers because of the constraining dissensus. On the other hand, we also have a functionalist response, so to say, to the post-functionalist argument that we associate most strongly with the work of Michael Zürn. And here, the starting point, the very basic one of all functionalist theories, is functionalist theories applied to international organizations, is that IOs and their authority is needed to solve problems of interdependence, right? That's the baseline thought here. And now politicization comes in, and functionalists will agree that this politicization will make authority transfers a little more complicated, and something has to be done about it, but they don't make, politicization doesn't make authority transfers impossible. Instead, what functionalists say is that the leaders of international organizations and the most important actors deciding over the fate of IOs are smart and will anticipate the constraining dissensus and try to accommodate contestant demands so as to basically reduce the prevailing constraining dissensus and thus enable more authority transfers. And how is this accommodation of contested demands going to happen? Well, here the theory says that in order to reduce and to temper the contestation, democratization is the option of choice, right? So it will make international institutions more responsive to contested demands. You will open them up to non-state actor participation, etc. So you will basically co-opt them into this global governance field. And so the expected outcome is a deepening, a democratic deepening of global governance from the functionalist perspective. And so, of course, we do agree very much that these two theories have a lot to offer, also in terms of explaining or highlighting really important empirical developments of the recent past, right? So the steep rise in international authority that we've seen throughout the 90s, for example, has come pretty much to a halt. So IO authority has been plateauing in the past decade, which is very much in alignment with the standstill expectation by post-functionalism. On the other hand, there is at least some superficial democratization of IOs happening as well, right? So there's lots of works that look at the opening up of IOs, at new accountability structures, at transparency coming in, and so on, which, at least at a superficial level, highlight that there is something happening here. And so we do not contest that that both have important messages to offer for contemporary phenomena. But I mean, first of all, what is interesting, I think, is that neither of them is able to really account for the empirical patterns that the other is able to account for, right? So functionalists are unable to really account for the standstill, and post-functionalists are at least do not really have anything to explain the democratization of IOs. But what we think is much more important than this is that there's also empirical phenomena that really represent all-out puzzles for both these theories. And these puzzling empirical phenomena we call the undemocratic internationalization of authority and the democratic renationalization of authority. And with undemocratic internationalization, we mean transfers of authority to international institutions that come about in extra-legal processes that basically are executive decisions and as such circumvent or simply reduce participation and deliberation, right? On the other hand, democratic renationalization, we talk about transfers of authority from international organizations back to their member states or single member states that happen in institutionalized domestic processes which enable public deliberation or equal participation, right? So the direction of the authority transfers differs across both, and also the way in which it comes about, either democratic or undemocratic. And I should add here that we do not really say something about the question of whether the end result is then a polity that is more or less democratic, but it's about the process of the transfer that either happens through a democratic or less democratic process. Now for the internationalization of the undemocratic internationalization of authority, we have two types that we define in the paper, that is intergovernmental transgressions and supranational transgressions. So they are either clearly backed by the by member states that get together to take decisions that deviate basically from the law of the international organization, that go into informal venues to circumvent the typical procedures and go basically through undemocratic backdoors. And the same is also possible also for autonomous international organization organs such as bureaucracies or courts. Some examples, I mean, I think the strongest examples come from the Eurozone crisis, the creation of the emergency credit facilities, EFSF and ESM, outside the legal framework of the EU, with a specific goal to circumvent all the democratic requirements that would be that would come along with them. The EU-Turkey deal might be another example of a move that is both substantively and procedurally questionable from a legal and democratic perspective. And I think look at the self-empowerment of the ECB during the Euro crisis. I guess a stark example for undemocratic internationalization that comes in form of the supranational transgression. Now, these undemocratic internationalizations of authority, we argue, are an obvious puzzle for post-functionalism, right? Because post-functionalism expects a standstill and no further authority transfers to IOs. But what we see is that sometimes even in the most politicized circumstances, such as the Eurozone crisis, we see more authority being transferred to the organizations. Such is an obvious puzzle for post-functionalism. But we argue it's also a puzzle for functionalism, because functionalism would expect a democratized version of this, and it's precisely the opposite, namely non-democratic authority transfers. On the other hand, we have the democratic renationalization of authority, where the two subtypes that we introduce are the obvious withdrawal from IOs and thus their authority, but also what we call disobedience. That would be the sustained and systematic non-compliance, principled disobedience, principled non-compliance with the norms, rules, etc., that emanate from IO authority, right? So the one is more of a formal renationalization of authority, and the other is a de facto renationalization of authority. Obvious examples for withdrawal are in the EU context are Brexit, but also the several opt-outs from existing or newly developed authority structures at the EU that come about in those institutionalized processes, for example, in referenda, or are due to previous election results that indicated clearly this direction. Same for disobedience. I think we all remember the complete non-compliance with Commission authority to introduce a refugee relocation scheme during the migration crisis, or now the disobedience of Hungary and Poland with the rule of law dimension of the European acquis communautaire. And so this, we argue, represents an obvious puzzle for functionalism, right? That would expect further internationalization of authority, even if a democratized version of that. But we argue it's also a puzzle for post-functionalism. Now, this might be a little more contentious because post-functionalists have already argued that actually they expect that their theory also might account for the disintegration or for disintegrative outcomes. However, what we think is that so the argument about the constraining dissensus is really strong in explaining standstill and not really strong at explaining disintegrative outcomes, because a constraining dissensus is something that is about a dissensus. What you need for disintegration is actually a new consensus among the population or among the relevant actors to effectuate such a step. And this is something we think that is not really theorized by post-functionalists. So maybe to a lesser extent, but it's still a puzzle also for post-functionalism. And now to address this double puzzle, we introduce our political contest theory, as we call it, certainly a mid or low range theory, but contains some new theoretical reflection on IO authority transfers in the age of politicization. That we start with a core assumption about a contest, a political contest between cosmopolitan and communitarian factions in society, and then three propositions that outline strategic and structural advantages for both the communitarian and the cosmopolitan side in this political struggle, which we argue leads to partial and unsustainable victories for both sides that explain the outcomes of undemocratic internationalization and democratic renationalization, which, and that is our third proposition, actually create a self-reinforcing feedback loop. So there's a dynamic between these two. Let me now delve into these aspects a little further. So our starting point is one that I think is really shared also still by functionalist and post-functionalist theories, and most academics working on the politicization of international institutions, the EU and IOs more broadly, in that in modern democracies, we see through this politicization the emergence of a new cleavage. It's been called the transnational cleavage, the Galtan cleavage in the European context in particular, but also beyond the EU with regard to other international organizations. This cleavage emerges, which pits on the one hand side cosmopolitan leaning factions versus cosmopolitan. What did I say first? Communitarian or cosmopolitan? So communitarians versus cosmopolitans. And our starting assumption is that in this era of politicization, the transfers of authority to and from IOs is decided in a political contest between those communitarian leaning actors and the cosmopolitan leaning actors that we define here, especially as political parties and their leaders in democracies. Now, what do communitarians and cosmopolitans want? And here, what we do is to present like ideal type positions of communitarians and cosmopolitans that we are well aware are not fully reflected in political discourse and a justification discourse by both sides. But we believe structures this political contest, and we will see that most actors align with either side more than the other. So we could say there's communitarian leaning and cosmopolitan leaning actors. So the ideal typical communitarian position would be one that values self-determination of the national community. That's kind of the core ideal for communitarians, that would claim that the only way that a society can be democratically structured is at the domestic level, because there is no demos beyond the state. So identification only is possible with the national polity, and hence, in order to preserve the possibility of national democracy, of national self-determination, is through a complete national sovereignty, right? So this position will go against transfers of authority to international organizations and is in favor of renationalization. The ideal typical cosmopolitan position, on the other hand, is, we argue, really created around the core value of equal rights and solidarity among world citizens, right? So the cosmopolitan, one of the key cosmopolitan goals would be to overcome the incongruence between the globalized social and the national political space, right? That we see that our key political units are still territorially defined, but that in a globalized world, problems obviously extend beyond borders and need to be dealt with also in that direction. And also to do that, this creates another democratic problem, right? Because if you cannot decide together in a democratic way on these transborder problems, it will always be single units that have external effects and thus create problems of democracy. So the idea here is global or regional integration, as this will also create the preconditions for cosmopolitan democracy, because there will be an identification with this new political space that creates a discursive space to also orient attitudes and positions towards this integrated polity. So the ideal typical cosmopolitan position is against the renationalization of authority clearly, and in favor of transfers of authority to IOs with a view to democratizing these IOs. Now, our first proposition is that in this political contest between communitarians and cosmopolitans, there is first and foremost an argumentative dimension, maybe a rhetorical power game, you could call it, where both sides seek to mobilize their supporters, right? And we argue that in this argumentative struggle over the right response to the democratic challenges of global governance, the communitarian promises are more credible and thus create stronger traction among their supporters, and thus communitarians have a mobilization advantage. And we argue that this is due to mainly two aspects here. The first is related to the identity dimension, and the other is related to the democracy dimension. So is the empirical preconditions, basically the political opportunity structure that both factions confront, will support arguments for of the communitarians more than the cosmopolitans. First, because national identities are much more deeply rooted than transnational identities. I think there's lots of literature supporting this claim. This has been showed even for the European Union, that is also the socially most integrated political space in the world, that people maintain primarily national identities and only secondarily so transnational European identities, and that also only for a smaller fraction of the population, and also in a decline in the past decades. So the idea of cosmopolitan democracy from this perspective as one which presupposes a demos beyond national borders must seem relatively far-fetched, if not impossible, right? Secondly, we argue that the promise to democratize by renationalizing authority is a promise that, in principle, can be achieved unilaterally, right? As we look at Brexit, for example, it just takes the decision of one state, eventually, to withdraw from the organization, and the promise can be fulfilled, right? So this contrasts really strongly with the cosmopolitan promise to reform and democratize international organizations, a process for which obviously all other member states and their constituencies are required as well. And given the many veto positions that exist in IOs, this is a process that's much harder to achieve, and thus we argue also seems relatively far-fetched, if not impossible. And hence, given these two aspects, we think that there is a strong mobilization advantage for communitarians, which allows them to get actually majorities to the polls when it comes down to voting on these issues. So majorities for renationalization are possible, and so our assertion or our proposition here is that the assertion of democratic renationalization is very likely when decisions are taken in political arenas, providing access to individual voters. So in particular, during referenda or when elections and election campaigns are really also about the question of international authority. Our second proposition then somehow counters this first one. So it says that while communitarians dominate the rhetorical terrain, cosmopolitans still dominate the institutional terrain. And so precisely when we're not talking about those exact moments in time where polls are open and people go to give their vote at the booth, we look at a situation in which international organizations and the key decision-making positions that they have are occupied actually by cosmopolitans or cosmopolitan-leaning personnel, right? So cosmopolitans occupy or wield influence over those key decision-making positions, and there is a strong cosmopolitan bias in IOs. It's the IO bureaucracies. I think that is very clearly the case that by self-selection and socialization in these bureaucracies, there's people going there that think in a cosmopolitan way, same as their executive heads, which very often represent ideal type cosmopolitans almost. Then we have democracies' foreign ministries, which are very often staffed with cosmopolitans. That then create kind of at international organizations in the diplomatic corps that are represented there, kind of this kind of English school idea of the international society that is pretty like-minded in the sense. And also we would say that of the leading democratic IO member states, heads of government, even there, these heads of government are still at least more cosmopolitan than the average citizen, right? And that for this is we have data from the Stockholm group, especially about the elite citizen gap in legitimacy perception of IOs, which supports this claim. So our point here is that in the rhetorical contest between communitarians and cosmopolitans, the communitarians might have the upper hand, but institutionally speaking, there is a clear power advantage for cosmopolitans, which allows them, when push comes to shove, to circumvent public dissent, to circumvent the communitarian opposition, and assert undemocratic internationalizations, especially, and this is our key condition here, when the IO survival is at stake, or in a crisis situation where governance provision is deemed more important than procedure. So we argue that basically the cosmopolitan-leaning advocates of international authority are likely to sacrifice the democratic promise that they have in order to uphold the governance provision, which they say is also in itself actually democracy enhancing. So this would be able to explain undemocratic internationalizations of authority. Now, our third proposition here is that these two things hang together, right? It's the third proposition is more of actually a theoretical implication of propositions 1 and 2, I would argue, and it argues that communitarians and cosmopolitans may win partial, but especially unsustainable victories each, right? So to get the democratic renationalization done and to get an undemocratic internationalization done is not the end of the story, because basically it creates conditions that are conducive to the other side's victory. For example, we argue that communitarian victories aggravate problems of interdependence that might require more collective solutions, especially when crises of interdependence occur, sometimes maybe precisely because of democratic renationalizations. Or we would argue that cosmopolitan victories will aggravate the democratic deficits at IOs, which is something that communitarian mobilization really works on, right? And seems to then testify to the rightness of this claim, and thus incite further contestation and even stronger mobilization on the communitarian end, potentially leading to more democratic renationalization. And so the question is whether we might see something like a vicious cycle like this, where maybe starting with the cosmopolitan institutional power advantage, which enables the undemocratic internationalization in times of crisis and when other institutional avenues are barred to take effect, which then confirms kind of the communitarian critique of international authority, that it is undemocratic, that there is distant elites taking decisions without the consent of the people, and thus reinforcing the communitarian mobilization advantage, because obviously they can build on this very well, potentially leading to more democratic renationalizations that in and of themselves are likely to create more problems of interdependence, because they basically take governance capacity away from international institutions and thus the ability to regulate cross-border problems, which, when push comes to shove, might reinforce the temptation for the cosmopolitans in power to use their institutional power advantage to internationalize authority further through non-democratic backdoors. So that would create the full cycle here. This are the four main steps in our theory, which have these two core propositions, and then the third proposition as a theoretical implication, basically. And I'll provide really quickly, I believe, some really just some empirical illustrations. And when I conclude, I will say a little bit more about the empirical avenues that future research should and could take to develop this project further. So maybe just quickly in support of proposition 1, the communitarian mobilization advantage, we look at our key example is Brexit, where we would argue that we have a clear communitarian mobilization advantage that comes from the fact that the Leave campaign was able to mobilize on identity issues, especially with regards to internal migration in the EU, and the idea of recreating popular sovereignty by taking back control, two tropes that were unmatched by the cosmopolitan attempts to create positive identification with the EU, right, on the identity level, and the promise to democratize the EU, or at least to create a better deal for the UK, which both have been pretty much rejected in this campaign for being unrealistic, right? And what has been basically achieved through this pre-referendum deal has been rejected as insufficient, right? So I think there was the idea that we won't get this any further or in the direction that we want, because it's too complicated. What is possible is to just withdraw. It's more the promise to democratize is more credible, and thus had a mobilization advantage. We have a shadow example with the World Trade Organization that runs through all three propositions, but I'll maybe skip that for the moment, and I'm happy to elaborate on the World Trade Organization later if you're interested. Also, obviously, in the applicability of this beyond the European Union, which is a big question, of course. But let's stick to the EU for the moment and look at some empirical evidence in support of Proposition 2, the cosmopolitan institutional power advantage. And here we take the authority transfers during the Euro crisis as the best example, where I think it was kind of commonsensical among the cosmopolitan elite at the time that to solve this crisis, new authority transfers were required. The problem was that these functional requirements, these governance capacities that were needed, were actually met by legal hurdles pretty much prohibiting precisely those authority transfers. Think of the no bailout clause, and also lots of public resistance, right? There was a high level of politicization also during the early days of the Euro crisis. There was the north-south divide. And I think if we had put all the authority transfers that have later been achieved in front of the people for a vote, that the outcome that this would have been rejected is very, very high, right? So what happened instead is that we had central EU decision makers, both governmental and supranational, that were strongly biased in a cosmopolitan direction, from Mario Draghi, but also Angela Merkel and Sarkozy. We had cosmopolitan-leaning decision makers that were able, due to their institutional power advantage, to basically transfer authority on avenues that were pretty much closed off to public contestation and democratic participation. I mean, the empowerment of the European Central Bank was a move of an executive decision, pretty much, that was only contestable ex post. The creation of the bailout mechanisms, the emergency credit facilities happened informally or outside the formal procedures envisioned in the EU. So here, an example or some evidence for the functioning of this institutional power advantage. Again, shadow example with the WTO and its appellate body for later, maybe. Now, where it becomes a little more suggestive even is with regard to the feedback loop and the question of the self-reinforcing cycle, to the extent that we really just suggest kind of a chain of events that actually kind of fits the idea here, and I'll be happy to discuss to what extent this claim can be made. But the idea would be that actually, if we look at these also the examples that just mentioned and the more general dynamics in the European Union, maybe some of the integration and disintegration steps of the past 2 decades are actually kind of nicely reframed in this context, in a sense that the post-Maastricht politicization of the European Union also led to the constraining dissensus that post-functionalist theories ascribe, which probably also already led to the incompleteness of the European Economic and Monetary Union, EMU, in a sense that that we had a strong integration of monetary policy with authority for the ECB, but no concomitant authority in the fiscal area, which remained completely intergovernmental. And we might argue that this incompleteness in this area already supported or enabled the critical moment of the Euro crisis later, where it became clear that, or where the functional pressures became so clear that it was to accommodate integrated monetary policy, the fiscal policy component was also necessary, and thus in this crisis moment led to an undemocratic internationalization of authority during the Euro crisis, which itself boosted, we argue, a communitarian mobilization. I mean, in Germany, for us, been very clear because the alternative for Germany, the Alternative für Deutschland, was created really as a response, as a clear response to the Euro crisis governance in Europe, and thus had some strong mobilization on the communitarian end, more democratic renationalizations that follow. And so at least maybe one cycle can be shown here. I'll leave it there with this concluding slide, which would talk a little bit about what we think might be a research program that follows from our theorization here, but I can also develop on that maybe in Q&A if I should. Yeah, I should come to an end. Thank you very much so far for your attention. I'm very much looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you so very much, Christian. Given that we started a little late and this is supposed to run for 1.5 hours, thank you for accommodating not discussing the concluding slide. And instead, we'll open up for comments, suggestions, questions from the audience online and in the room. And admittedly, Sarah, in case you can hear me, the PowerPoint, there is a big box in front of people's names. In case they're raising their hand, can we close this box, La Réunion? Well, actually, I'm reading French and it's Italian, but yeah, well, we'll see. Right now, I cannot see everybody online. Hopefully that's going to work, but I see plenty of hands already in the room. Sorry.
Can you see everybody? You can change
there's
things
a box in the middle that I cannot see on the screen here on the laptop.
Let's see how we can fix that.
Yes, so I mean, it says like you can hit something on the box, but it's in the middle of the Zoom screen.
Let's see how we can fix that.
Right. Marius, I think we found the solution. Perfect, all done. Thank you very much. And Marius, given that your hand was up, the floor is yours.
So I found this presentation, I haven't read the paper yet, but the presentation was extremely interesting and it talks a lot with my own research on identity contestation and cultural struggles and how those affect foreign policy and international relations. So I think that your model is actually extremely interesting, and I buy a lot into the assumption that we are talking about cultural contestation and cultural conflict struggles at the domestic level. My own research is on the same topic. But I have a few comments regarding your explicit or implicit assumptions. Like, for example, in your first proposition, you are saying that communitarian mobilization has an advantage because their premises are more credible. Why? Because national identities are more deeply rooted than transnational identities. Well, here you are assuming that there is one homogeneous and relatively exclusionary notion of national identity, which is rather an empirical claim to be tested empirically than to be assumed theoretically. Like if you look in the literature in nationalist studies and political sociology of nationalism, you can see that in the last years, in fact, the last 2 decades, the consensus in this literature has been that there is no single notion of national identity, that nations are internally heterogeneous. Various parts of the nation hold distinct notions of what it means to be German, Italian, French, whatever. And what's interesting is that the cultural level, at the national level, there's a dominant notion. It's like in France, you have this republicanist notion of Frenchness, but this doesn't mean that alternative notions of Frenchness don't exist, like the conservative Christian notions of Frenchness, which are more promoted by Le Pen and so on. So I would not assume that nations are automatically exclusionary, and therefore, being exclusionary, they inform and feed into these communitarian premises, the communitarian exclusionary camp in the domestic conflict. So, and related to this, and also linked with your second proposition, is that you're assuming, or at least the model of this cultural conflict, as I see it, is that you have these elites which have cosmopolitan values, and which they try to impose upon society, and the society which has exclusionary and, let's say, traditional values grounded in national values and so on, more conservative, are pushing back. And this is a model we see in populist studies. We see a model which you could argue it's also linked with post-functionalism. But again, are all elites cosmopolitan? Is the entire public having rather exclusionary values? Like in my own, and linking it with my own research, I'm seeing this not necessarily as a pushback, as a contestation between elite-imposed cosmopolitan values versus grassroots opposition to this, but more like horizontal competition between various factions in society who try to impose their own notions on society. It's like you may have a group which is more, believes that values such as the family and so on, nation, exclusionary understandings of who belongs to the nation are the appropriate ones, and others who are informed by globalization and so on, who have more cosmopolitan views. But I would push back against this top versus bottom approaches, which are so common and which are simplistic in my view, and don't actually tell us that much. We assume that most of the public is the same, it's homogeneous, and most of the elites are the same, homogeneous, cosmopolitans versus communitarians. So I would be a bit more nuanced in this regard. And regarding, and this is my last point, regarding the third proposition, so you are saying that cosmopolitans are basically using their institution, their leverage, institutional leverage, to basically expand or increase authority of international organizations. But is that always the case? Like if we look at the Hungarian case, when Orban came into power, he basically either excluded or marginalized the cosmopolitans in institutions and put his own people, which are promoting his own view of society and of the European Union and of international relations. So in that case, that may explain now why Hungary is rather reluctant to increase authority of international states. You could argue that it's not cosmopolitans who are now using are wielding power, but in fact the communitarians, and that they have been able to impose a new consensus in Hungarian society, for example. And the last point is a question. Does the configuration of the domestic structure matter, and of political institutions? Does it matter if the institutional framework in the country is more centralized and insulated from public influence than if the institutional framework is more decentralized and more prone to, more less insulated from public influence? Because if we could argue that if the domestic structure is decentralized and open to public influence, then the ability of cosmopolitan elites to actually impose their will be less likely, not as powerful than if you have a centralized, insulated state. In that case, the public has less influence to shape public policy. Therefore, cosmopolitans, if they are in power, they will be able to have a higher say. Thank you.
Thank you very much. There was a lot already in there. Do you mind if I have one more person and then we go back, and then there are a few more on the list, please?
Thank you for your presentation.
Sorry, if I may interrupt, if you could briefly introduce yourself,
Oh,
so that Christian knows who's talking about too,
All right.
which is well, Mario's apologies, I forgot, PhD student at the SPS department, please.
Yes. I'm Helga Malbæk-Stensig. I'm a PhD student at the law department. I'm doing a project on the European Court of Human Rights and the legitimacy in society. So it's very much the same type of contestation, but not political in the same way, because it's between the judicial and the political. I really liked your presentation. I thought it was very interesting. And I think your theory on the political contestation is extremely interesting and possibly useful even for people who are working from a law perspective as well. I was wondering, however, there seems to be an uncritical connection between democracy and communitarianism, which I find problematic and also hard to follow, because it seems to me that you say that national leaders are democratically elected, but then as soon as they go to the European Union and talk to other democratic electors, they immediately become undemocratic cosmopolitanists, and that seems odd to me. The other problem with the uncritical connection between the national or the communitarian and democracy is that a lot of the things you mentioned are actually like Brexit, for example. Brexit absolutely did use a backdoor, an undemocratic backdoor, and tried to circumvent Parliament, and was only kept from doing so after a try in court. You don't remember this? There was this. So Brexit was the British government held the elections, the referendum for Brexit, but they did not take it through Parliament when they tried to initiate Article 50. And eventually there was a case brought before the British High Court, and the British High Court determined that they could not do that they needed democratic backing. And eventually they got the democratic backing and wasn't a problem. But they absolutely tried to circumvent it. And my other question is, the other thing that you call renationalization, the disobedience on refugees from Poland and Hungary, that's absolutely executive decisions. These are not democratic decisions, really, to any larger extent than anything else. So there seems to be this determination, which comes from the communitarian theory, right? That something that is not national cannot be democratic. So when the national central banks make decisions about the currency in crisis, we don't think of it as a problem, but the European Central Bank does. We do think of it as a democratic problem. And I was just wondering if you could engage with that a little more in depth, because otherwise it feels like your theory says, oh, it's communitarianism versus cosmopolitanism, and by the way, communitarianism is right. And that seems sad, given your ambition, which seems grander. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think many of the questions already point to, is it just only about communitarianisms and cosmopolitanism? Where are they located, right? So I think if you don't mind engaging a bit with these questions, knowingly that there are at least 5 more people afterwards who would like to ask a question as well. But briefly, back to you.
Excellent. Thank you so much for these great comments and questions. They're, I think, extremely engaging and helpful also to further think about this. So Mario, right? Mars. All right. Thanks. I think you point to a lot of nuance that we're not highlighting that I fully did not highlight in the presentation, and we do not highlight enough in the paper. And I agree with that. I would argue that we're not just trying to say, you know, there is the cosmopolitan elite, and then there's the communitarian, the unitary communitarian, and the unitary cosmopolitan elites versus the top versus bottom. I think that's not exactly what we're trying to say. What we're trying to say is that actually, even with regard to Brexit, for example, of course, it's almost 50-50, right? If you look at the attitudes, and I mean, most polls said before the referendum that there were more people in favor of remaining than for leaving. So which means that there is lots of cosmopolitan leaning population parts as well. What we are saying, though, is that the communitarian political offer creates a stronger mobilization, which might actually even explain the outcome, that even though there might even be a subtle majority of cosmopolitan leaning people out there, they're not going to the polls necessarily to cast their vote, because the communitarians are just more strongly mobilized to do so. So it's a claim about the mobilization of one group, not that they're all this or all that. And especially with regard to elites and executives, there as well, of course, we argue that most of them are cosmopolitan leaning, and that there is a overall cosmopolitan bias. But we're acutely aware, of course, that that potentially also because of the mobilization advantage that communitarians have, there are more and more communitarians in power, right? And so, I mean, that's the literature on populists in power, etc., is obviously speaking to that. So I see your point about Hungary, for example, of not really fitting the overall scheme, and that there's all these domestic governments of democracies that are cosmopolitan leaning. That's why there's always also in brackets still in our paper when we talk about the cosmopolitan institutional power advantage, because in a majority of states and overall in IOs, I think it is present. At the domestic level, it's being more contested. And to your final question, I think I agree that this you could say the more openly democratic and the more direct democracy is there in a state, the more likely it is to be vulnerable to the communitarian challenge, precisely because of the mechanism that we introduce.
I would argue the opposite.
Okay, then let's discuss that. Thanks for the comment about the uncritical connection between communitarianism and democracy, which is fair, I think, on a number of levels. I think when we first thought about using these terms also of democratic renationalization, we kind of expected that this would be a provocation, and I think it does this rightly so. The point, though, is that we really, if we just look at the process in which the authority transfer comes about, then I think we can really say that there is processes of internationalization that really do not qualify as democratic processes in any way, whereas there is processes of renationalization. They might not all really fit that model, but that at least have the voter backing. So in the literature, we have also the notion of Stephanie Walter in particular speaks of voter endorsed renationalization. Okay, and I think that is obviously the case when we look at, as you said, Hungary and Poland. And the relocation scheme, right? It's not that there's a referendum on this and then it's being taken back, but I think the decision they took is very much voter endorsed, right? That there would be clear majorities and these governments have been elected on a ticket to reject such authority transfers, right? So I would say there is a democratic connection and a democratic connection that I think is not really given in a case of, IO empowerment, that really seeks to circumvent already the anticipated backlash from voters.
Thank you. I'm going to now group 3 questions together, just so you know. I have next on the list Franka Feise, Philipp Genschel, and then Katrin Höffler.
Yes, thanks a lot. And thank you for indeed a super interesting presentation and paper as well. My first comment builds a bit on what was discussed now. I also had some doubts when reading your paper about how the example of Hungary and Poland fits in the kind of same breath with examples for democratic renationalization. Because as well, you might have a point with what you just mentioned, the refugee relocation. But for instance, I just have vividly in mind the pictures of Polish people heading to the streets when the Polish Constitutional Court, which is essentially a kangaroo court at this point, questioned the primacy of EU law. So I'm not sure if I would call this also a mobilization advantage, but at this point of also autocratization and entrenchment by the at once elected parties of their political power, whether it's not more kind of a manipulation advantage, as you can maybe also see with referenda in Hungary, how they are framed to begin with highly suggestive questions. And then that brings me to my second point. I was thinking of a different empirical example, which I don't quite see fitting into your scheme, and I'd be very interested in what you would make of it. So for instance, the German Constitutional Court and its judgments on European integration, setting clear limits on European integration in the name of democracy, but obviously as being a counter-majoritarian institution, and also with, for instance, let's say the Lisbon Treaty judgment at a point in time where there was, empirically speaking, at least a majority in the German population for further European integration, whatever that entails. That's of course fairly vague, but yeah, I'm not sure, because this is an institution which, being also a member state institution, has a clear power advantage as well, I would say. And this is not cosmopolitan minded in this case, one might say, at least, although this is of course a very contested issue in itself, the whole jurisprudence of the German Constitutional Court on EU integration. And kind of this ultimately brings me to, yeah, I think that there might be a need for further refinement of the notions of democratic and undemocratic, how you understand them in your paper. I mean, you put them in quotation marks already, which suggests to me that you see that it's not quite straightforward, and that many of those cases can be contested as to whether they qualify as democratic or undemocratic, and by what standards. And especially at the feeling, the undemocratic, a bit along the lines of what Helga just said, presupposes or implies that power transfers to international organizations either cannot be democratic at all, or were democratic once and not anymore. And then it would mean like, okay, why and how have we arrived at an undemocratic point? So basically, do you mean would then a democratic power transfer just be one that is within the bounds of the treaty rules? And that being democratic because the treaty was concluded by member states whose parliaments approved it, and whose parliaments approved that member states' accession to the EU in the first place? Or if that is not enough for democratic legitimation, is there a need for a referendum, which I felt sometimes like being emphasized as an example? If so, would then the democratic transfer only hold for the member states that actually held a referendum? So I think the kind of quotation marks that are put on the terms undemocratic and democratic to begin with might need a bit more fleshing out, and I'd be interested in how you would do that.
Yes, thank you also for this talk. I have 3 questions. The first is, how puzzling is your puzzle? You know, undemocratic internationalization is really the default mode of internationalization, and democratic internationalization is rather an exception. Democratic renationalization, you know, renationalization does not necessarily contradict functionalism. You know, there's always this assumption that the only way to deal with interdependence is to manage it internationally. But the alternative is, of course, to cut off interdependencies. And if you don't like Brexit, you know, call it strategic autonomy or European sovereignty or whatever, or onshoring supply chains. You know, these are functional reactions, functional reasons for renationalization, which brings me to my second question on contest theory. Is something missing here? So you have post-functionalism, and that's about identity, and you have functionalism that's about function, interest. Okay, but you know, your dimension of contestation is only on identity. Communitarians versus cosmopolitans. It doesn't really show, because the cosmopolitans in your scheme are also responsible for the functional advantages of internationalization, which is not really true, because people like Orban, of course, have an exclusive national identity, but still see the functional advantages of being in the EU. So my question is, do you need 2 dimensions here? One is communitarian versus cosmopolitan, and the other is, however you call it, protectionist versus international interests. And finally, on your example of the unpopularity of emergency measures to fight the Eurozone crisis. Yes, of course, they were unpopular, but at the same time, the euro was very popular. You know, neither Greece nor Germany ever wanted to give up on the euro. They wanted to keep it. The problem was the population didn't want to support what policymakers thought was necessary in order to keep the euro. Now, holding inconsistent preferences is a privilege of voters, but the job of governments is to make them consistent. And that involves that sometimes governments have to override voter interests in the best interest of the voters. You know, that's this trade-off between responsive and responsible government, and that's not showing at all in your conception.
Lucky you, Christian. Philip asked most of my questions. I'm taking myself off the list. Catherine, and then back to Christian, and then I still have you and Calypso on the list as well for the third round. So keeping in mind that we have about 20 minutes left. Sorry for signaling so strongly, but so that everybody knows more or less how much time is left. Sorry, Catherine first, and then back to Christian.
Thank you very much. I don't know if you hear me. For the last 3 minutes, my connection has been very unstable, so I'll try to keep it very brief also because, okay, many of my questions already have been asked, but thank you very much for your talk. Somehow it reminded me of a piece by Eric Jones, Dan Kahneman, and Sophie Meunier about the failing forward kind of argument, that there are dysfunctions or incompleteness of institutions, and that push for pressures to further integration. So in a certain way, you complement well this kind of argument by basically giving us a rationale for why, for the political roots of these institutional incompleteness. At the same time, I agree and I tag along what's just been said about the maybe a need to better delineate the communitarian from the cosmopolitan as governments play both cards. And I was also wondering, this also speaks to what Frank has just said about not only the level or intensity of integration or transfers of authority, but also the nature of the measures in place. As you would have, for instance, British left wing that would be against more transfers of authority, but not on the basis of wanting a renationalization, but because of the nature of the measures that have been taken. So the divide about the community versus cosmopolitan kind of position, I think, doesn't hold neatly in your categories here. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thanks a lot. So there's lots of questions about the communitarian cosmopolitan distinction and their democratic or undemocratic credentials, so to say, and rightly so, I guess. So the Franca's point about the German Constitutional Court got me thinking, because I think it's a really good point, and got me wondering. But I mean it would be a real challenge if it had not been the German Constitutional Court, but the European Court of Justice going in that direction, right? With the German Constitutional Court, I think you're right that we here see an actor that is not a fully cosmopolitan in outlook, so to say, and say, you know, whatever the context, whatever the situation, we support European integration or international legal integration whatsoever for Germany, and then that is true, right? So there's a point to be highlighted again, and the different nuances that are that we're not speaking about the cosmopolitan elite that is cosmopolitan across the board and everyone to the same degree. Is probably the only answer that I can. Is my, because you asked on my take for my take on this issue, and I think that is my my take, even if it's not very elaborate. How can there be democratic transfers of authority to international institutions, and what would they look like? And here, this also contradicts Philip's first point. I think I mean, there is right now, there's quite the elaborate debate about constituent power in the European Union ongoing, about the question, how can we actually transfer political authority in a way that is democratically appropriate? How can we constitute authority democratically? But and as Philip Putbeck, for example, going in depth in this direction, and he would say, you know, just the democratic intergovernmentalism that we're used to is not enough. I mean, and that would speak to your point that it's never been fully democratic. However, I would say, and here we're also trying to contrast the undemocratic nature of authority transfers from at least those that follow established delegation chains and procedures, legal procedures that have been set in place for ratification and democratic participation. This would qualify indeed as something as a democratic internationalization of authority. And that is the one type of authority transfer that we've seen throughout history, right? That is, of course, the negotiation phase not very democratic, but at least we find the ratification phase being pretty democratic, right? So there is at least eventually at some point either democratic representatives or voters themselves that say, yes, we want this or we do not want this. And if there's the democratic support for internationalization, then we would say, no, this follows this path. I think what Katrin just said is very interesting as well. I guess what we really, what maybe has been, what I did not bring out well enough in my presentation is that we would probably not argue that the cosmopolitan communitarian divide is purely about the cultural dimension, right? We would argue that is actually, it's a political dimension. That is a lot about the question of how you can realize the people's self-determination. Actually, it's a democracy question all over. And this democracy question, I think, thus also unites left and right, right? So you can, as you said, Katrin, there were Brexiteers that would not align with the right-wing populist propaganda, but say we still want to leave the EU because we're not able to implement a social agenda in this European Union. And why? Because it does not allow for democratic input from this direction, right? So it's a democratic argument. You cannot. There's a democratic problem in the European Union that cannot be solved at the European level. And so we need to renationalize this authority, right? That's, I think, my argument here. On the other hand, to you, Philip, I have to say that these were really strong critical comments that I'll have to think about. I guess whether whether we need to divide the dimensions and really think about that there is a cosmopolitan communitarian plus what do you say, protectionist or nationalist versus internationalist dimension. I really have to think about it. It's not that we thought about it and rejected it before. It would be something new. I wonder though whether the Orban example is, whether he is kind of an outlier in this regard, or whether that is the typical, this is a typical stance, right? That we see lots of communitarians out there that will mobilize on a cultural dimension, but then say, well, for all the functional benefits of international integration, that's pretty cool. We like the economic integration, and we'll deal with that. Because with Brexit, we did not see that, for example, right? So I think that I need to do some more thinking on that. Thank you for the hint.
Thank you. So please.
Thank you very much. My name is Michael, and I'm a visiting fellow at the Robert Schuman Center. Just a few points, I'll race through them. First is, I thought it was a marvelous paper. I thought it was really excellent and very convincing and very well argued. Just to mention something, an anecdote, a few years ago, I was working in Brussels, and the then Trade Commissioner, Karel de Gucht, he just mentioned quite openly about how the Lisbon Treaty was really just the European Constitution. You know, he was quite honest, but you could say cynical, I suppose. Then a couple of points about Britain that I think you could possibly make more. Obviously, you've covered Brexit, but that Britain is a very particular country in the sense that how many other countries could have avoided having a second referendum? I mean, essentially, possibly nobody else could have got, you know, been, for want of a better term, strong enough to withstand that. Then another thing is that one of the things that's come out, certainly for me, it's the first time to notice it, in a biography of Nigel Farage, is how actually the introduction of proportional representation greatly helped his political fortunes. So it's kind of incredibly ironic that if they hadn't introduced PR, he might never have come to the prominence and his party, etc. Then a couple of drafting things, you refer to the so-called migration crisis. I think there was a migration crisis, so I would just say migration crisis. And then at one point you say pro-Brexit referendum. I presume you probably mean the outcome was pro-Brexit, so fine. And then my final point is that I think it'd be absolutely wonderful. I mean, you focused on the EU, you've been quite open about that, but if you could extend your research to the United Nations. I mean, you did, you know, you mentioned the WTO, but like when you think about it, which country has the presidency of the UN Security Council at the moment? Can you believe it's Russia? You know, so again, it's kind of unbelievable almost. And it's a different strand of research, but I think it's, you know, we are talking about international organizations, and the EU is kind of a particular type of hybrid. So it's something that you might consider getting into. It would be the UN system. And thank you very much again.
Calypso, please.
Yeah, I love the paper too, and definitely an issue we were all grappling with. And I agree with a lot of what Philip in particular said, but I just want to put it in slightly different ways. 2 points. One is that, to me, this discussion illustrates the fact that perhaps as important is the cleavage between Democrats and non-Democrats. In part, that's what we're saying in contesting the communitarian and cosmopolitan kind of homogenization, because isn't it the case that what we do see is a lot of convergence between undemocratic internationalization and undemocratic renationalization through the co-optation and insulation of elites, the role of executives, etc., all in the name of Philip's, you know, mitigating voters' inconsistency and Plato's wise leaders. But we could illustrate that more. And then, of course, secondly, democratic renationalization, to me, and that's part of what you were saying, Christian, is part of the agenda of democratic internationalization. You know, when we talk about the German Constitutional Court, I mean, to me, in part, it illustrates the kind of maybe what we could say a true Kantianism, where we have to ask what kind of, you know, rooted cosmopolitanism, you know, which has to do with indeed liberal peace and cosmopolitanism rooted in national democracy or local democracy. And you say that, you know, the institutional leverage, the institutional power side is, you know, correlated with the increased authorities of IOs, but a lot of the judicial activism in WTOs in the last, you know, 30, 25 years has been, in fact, sometimes very much about subsidiarity. And similarly, when we study differentiation in IOs, it has a lot to do with the best level, the subsidiarity level, and regime complexes. What is the best level of and division of labor between different democratic processes? And I would also argue that the Conference on the Future of Europe, in which many of us are involved, is all about, regions and cities, but not as opposed to EU democracy, but to strengthen EU democracy. So anyway, that's one point about the democracy divide, which is what kind of occupies me more. And also my second point is about the cleavage, the kind of cleavage envy of political science. It's always about a cleavage, and what does it tell us? But my kind of take would be that, in fact, I was interested in your word leaning, cosmopolitan leaning and communitarian leaning, because as important is another group out there of citizens who are ambivalent, not indifferent, but ambivalent between the two, and have some of the two, and are, what I tend to call transnational, and the kind of people we had in Florence, in December, who were they're not very into democratizing down or up, but transnationally. So that's a category that, at least to me, is as relevant in this conversation, which doesn't take away from the huge insights from your paper. Thanks.
Is this the final? Do we have? All right. Again, thank you so much for this this amazing discussion, which really is greatly helpful for us, and also just super engaging and interesting. I think there's several points that are challenging as well, and that I'll need to think about more. I mean, what I find very fascinating is that now, the second or third time that I present this paper, and the idea that there's that we need to think about more dimensions and more subtleties along the question of who's actually pitting whom against whom here, right? This is new in this discussion, and gives me something to really think about more. Now, I guess maybe to explain where we come from. It's also, I think that we were very much shaped by the findings of the group with Michael Zürn, but also and especially Peter de Wilde, and their big empirical project about voter attitudes towards international authority, basically, or the international, towards globalization, right? In their book Struggles about Borders, or For Borders, I don't remember. What they really find is that the structuring elements in questions relating to the domestic international divide is something that could be called the opposition of cosmopolitans and communitarians, or cosmopolitan leaning and communitarian leaning people. And there you have for the communitarian side, you have the coming together of basically three aspects, namely to be in favor of the nation and not in favor of international authority. So you're against international authority. You're also against migration, and you're leaning towards conservative values, right? Versus the cosmopolitan side, which is just opposing to this on the other end. And I think my leaning, or this leaning, where just tries to point to the fact that, of course, probably very few people are 100% on this end and or on the other end, but will associate more with one or the other. And I think Calypso, that's the point about cleavages, right? They're key conflict lines in political debates. That doesn't mean that there's not other conflict lines also shaping political debate, but I think all the literature on the different ways that this cleavage has been called by now, the Galtan, the transnational cleavage, the international national one, or the cosmopolitan communitarian, they're all saying that there is something new in our political systems, namely that they're from capital and the capital labor cleavage. We have a new one that is structuring political debate in modern democracies, and this is the one that we're looking at. and think that it is really marking the contestation around or the political debate about IO authority transfers. And here is our take. That's why we focus on these two positions. Maybe they're not fully, we haven't spelled them out well enough and have to think about what exactly these positions really consist in, and also better how they really relate to democracy and non-democracy, so to say, in this paper. But I think we might stick to the polls at least. So yeah, here, thank you very, very much for all these interesting comments and the great debate.
Thank you very much. Before we maybe give him a final round of applause, if I may just briefly still say that, so this was the very first talk of the Europe in the World series. And again, greatly appreciative that Christian came, just as a little hint for the next few months. So there's going to be Simone Dietrich is going to present in the series next month, co-sponsored, and I'm looking at Marius because it's with his working group, with the IR working group. The month after that, we're going to have Maria Giulia Amadio, who's a Marie Curie fellow here, and that's co-sponsored with the EU working group. So we're going to have a talk there. And then in May, Brian Rathbun from USC in LA is going to speak about actually various cleavages, looking back into how they inform our preferences towards international organizations. So with that being said, I hope to see you again soon. But in the meantime, thank you so much, Christian, for presenting your work.